Our trade in goods between Singapore and Africa grew 15% each year between 2019 and 2022. As of 2021, Singapore companies have invested more than 32 billion Singapore dollars in the continent.
Now, to share more on how we can tap opportunities there, we have two guests with us. Jayakrishnan is Executive Director at Enterprise Singapore, while Malini Kannan is Chief Operating Officer of Thunes. That's a Singapore-based cross-border payment service provider that has expanded into Africa. Good evening to both of you. Mr. Jayakrishnan, let's get to you first. Tell us what types of main business activity there are between Singapore and African countries, especially now that we're seeing more Singapore companies actually choosing to venture there.
Yeah, there are actually 100 Singapore companies operating across 40 countries in Africa. And as you say, the investment amount is 32 billion. That makes us actually amongst the top 10 foreign investors into Africa. And these companies are operating in a range of sectors, including agribusiness, manufacturing, transport and logistics, and also quite a few are involved in the digital economy.
Mr. Jayakrishnan, Africa, at least until fairly recently, has not been referred to generally as the place businesses in Singapore might choose to expand to. And yet you say, even so, we're amongst the top 10. That means the potential really is there for further expansion, further growth. But which sectors should we in Singapore be looking at on the African continent?
Right. We see three very important growth opportunities. The first is really in the digital economy. Now, digitalization has been transformative for the African continent. It's brought millions of people into the consumer economy. It's made consumption of government services and private sector services that much easier. What it means is actually creating opportunities for companies that are enabling more of such services to be consumed. So companies who are providing cybersecurity, data analytics, e-commerce platforms, and so on. So the digital economy is certainly one of those areas that has really been growing fast. The second area that I would mention is manufacturing. And a key driver for manufacturing here is the recently ratified Africa Continental Free Trade Area. In effect, this is a free trade agreement that brings close to 50 African nations together in a single trading bloc, reducing tariffs to close to zero. And what hasn't happened in Africa in the past is actually cross-border trade. Now, this FTA is going to facilitate and enable that. And we believe that
cross-border is between the continent and elsewhere, or within the continent?
Between African countries. It's been very low compared to other regions in the world. So we believe that the African FTA is going to enable that and is going to drive foreign investment and local investment into manufacturing to produce in Africa and for export. And finally, the third area of opportunity and for growth has to be around sustainability and the green economy. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world. So millions of people are moving to cities and they're going to be living in built-up areas. And this is going to drive a demand for green building solutions, energy-efficient solutions, waste and water management. That's one area. And second, Africa is actually the second largest carbon sink in the world after the Amazon basin. So it's going to be a critical part of the carbon equation for the world. It's very rich in natural resources, carbon assets, and it's going to be there a critical part of the carbon credit exchange globally.
That growth, it also drives up the demand for services, service payments, and so on. So let's bring Malini into the conversation here, because Thunes is very services focused. Malini, tell us why your company chose to expand into the continent.
Thank you for having us here today, sharing a little bit of our story. We're Singapore headquartered. We were born out of Singapore, but Africa was our first frontier. And one of the reasons for that was the first endeavor we had was to build interoperability between mobile wallets. And a couple of years ago, and I'm thinking maybe 2017, 2018, mobile wallet adoption really grew phenomenally across Africa. And it was in a broad-based way, not just any one country or any one region. That's where, we saw an immediate opportunity. One of our first projects was actually connecting Safaricom M-Pesa to PayPal. And this was really to enable Kenyans to truly participate in the global economy, to be able to be gig economy workers that are collecting payments from the US or to shop on overseas sites, whether it's in the US or Europe. And that's really sort of the transformative power of cross-border payment platforms. Today, we've expanded far beyond that. We're connecting about 35 African countries, 370 million mobile wallets, 280 million bank accounts, and even sort of to your point around intra-Africa or between African countries, we're facilitating about 200 plus payment corridors. And all of this is directly translating into a rapid sort of growth of digital economy transactions, right? And that's what we witness, and that's what we're really happy to be a part of.
Ms. Kannan, off the top of my head, there would be, I suppose, challenges when it comes to digital economy growth. I mean, obvious possibilities would be you need the infrastructure, you need access, you need regulation, you need human expertise as well. In your expansion, your firm was founded in 2016. What are the greatest challenges you face expanding into Africa?
I think you call that quite a few. The way we've been thinking about it is really Africa is a very diverse and dynamic continent, right? It's 54 countries, 42 currencies. And so it's really important to examine each country, the local regulatory framework, the currency control mechanisms, the payment ecosystem, payment providers, as well as the technological maturity. So I think in sort of our expansion, we've really gone local in terms of building teams. We've spent a lot of time understanding these challenges and sometimes participating in developing technological maturity within these ecosystems. And I think what keeps us really going is the massive opportunity. It's the youngest and fastest growing continent. 60% of the continent is under the age of 25. It poses tremendous opportunity for growth. And so I think we saw ourselves playing a lot more of a foundational role here.
Mr. Jayakrishnan, as Malini describes it there, the ground is very different depending on which African country you're in. So for companies that are perhaps thinking about venturing to Africa, Singapore companies, how can they circumvent similar challenges like Thunes experienced?
You're right. And taking off Malini's point, it's a continent of 54 countries. And one of the first challenges that firms, actually not just Singapore firms, have to deal with is where do I start? Which of the 54 countries is the right one for me? And what should be the mode of entry, the business model that we use? So Enterprise Singapore, we've been on the ground in Africa in 3 offices since 2013. And we help the Singapore firms really navigate these issues. Transparency and the lack of information, that's one of the biggest issues. How do you validate your partners? How do you validate the credibility of an opportunity? So we have to extrapolate various sources of information and then guide the companies through using a network of relationships and partners. The other challenge is that certainty. It is the case that regulations and policies do change without much notice. And that's quite different from our experience here in Singapore. So companies do have to deal with that. And finally, I would mention in terms of other challenges, really foreign currency, exchange risk, and also the inflation is high. So companies have to factor in these costs, ensure that they have margins that are large enough to account for them.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Mr. G. Jayakrishnan, Executive Director for South Asia, Middle East and Africa Enterprise Singapore, and of course, Ms. Malini Kannan, Chief Operating Officer at Thunes. Thanks for joining us this evening.